Zoe stared at the empty classroom and wondered, not for the first time, how she'd managed to volunteer herself into what was rapidly becoming the worst assignment in the known galaxy. The sterile white walls of Nexus Prime's education wing seemed to mock her with their pristine emptiness. No claw marks, no scorch marks, no evidence whatsoever that anyone had ever attempted to learn anything in this godforsaken room. Well, that wasn't entirely accurate. There had been learning. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. The Velnari cubs had learned, with remarkable efficiency, exactly how to avoid every single one of her lessons. "They're just children," she muttered to herself, straightening the perfectly aligned chairs for the third time that morning. Predator children, with razor-sharp claws, and the attention span of caffeinated squirrels. But still, children. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, a xenobiologist who'd spent most of her career studying alien life forms from a safe distance, had somehow ended up as an educator. When the Galactic Council had announced their grand interspecies youth integration program, Zoe had foolishly thought it sounded noble. Bring together the offspring of various species, foster understanding, build bridges between cultures. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Absolutely everything. The door hissed open, and Gavex strode in with the kind of purposeful gait that suggested either very good news or very bad news. Given recent events, Zoe was betting on the latter. The Velnari administrator stood nearly 3 meters tall, his obsidian black scales gleaming under the artificial lighting, and possessed all the warmth and charm of a tax audit. "The Cubs missed another session yesterday," he announced without preamble, his voice carrying that peculiar harmonic quality that made every Velnari sound like they were speaking through a synthesizer. "That makes 16 consecutive absences." "I'm aware," Zoe replied, attempting to project confidence she absolutely didn't feel. "I've been adjusting my approach." Gavex's head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. "Adjusting how exactly?" The curriculum was designed by the finest educational minds in the consortium. Mathematical foundations, linguistic protocols, scientific methodologies. All of which, Zoe interrupted, assume the students actually show up to class. The administrator's silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Velnari communicated as much through pheromone release as vocalization, and right now the air was thick with what Zoe had learned to recognize as barely contained frustration, mixed with something that might have been disappointment. "The Cubs are difficult," Gavex finally admitted. "Their species has certain behavioral challenges when it comes to traditional learning environments." Behavioral challenges. That was one way to put it. Another way would be to say that Velnari cubs possessed all the natural curiosity of their apex predator heritage combined with the impulse control of a sugar-high toddler and the attention span of a goldfish with ADHD. The first week had been educational, in the sense that Zoe had learned exactly how quickly a lesson on basic mathematics could devolve into what could only be described as recreational furniture destruction. The second week had taught her that Velnari cubs viewed any structured activity as a personal challenge to their autonomy. By the third week, she'd begun to suspect they were actively coordinating their avoidance tactics. "Where exactly do they go during lesson time?" she asked. "The ventilation systems, mostly." Gavex's tone suggested this was both entirely predictable and completely unacceptable. "Occasionally the cargo bays. Last week, Station security found them in the hydroponics lab, apparently conducting their own experiments on plant biology. Zoe winced. She'd heard about the hydroponics incident. The cleanup had taken 3 days, and the botanical staff still broke into stress-induced trembling at the mention of alternative growing methods. Perhaps, Gavex continued, we should consider that some species are simply not suited for integrated education. The Velnari have thrived for millennia without formal academic structures. Their young learn through observation, imitation, and what your species might call trial by fire. There it was, the admission of defeat wrapped in diplomatic language. Zoe had heard variations of this speech from administrators across the station. The Cathani delegation had used similar phrasing when their offspring proved incompatible with group activities. The Zorathi had been more direct, simply withdrawing their young after what they termed cultural incompatibilities. But something about giving up on the Velnari cubs bothered her. Maybe it was professional pride, or maybe it was the memory of Vilks, the smallest of the group, who'd lingered just outside the classroom door for nearly 10 minutes during her second week, clearly wanting to enter but held back by some invisible barrier. "Give me more time," Zoe said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Gavex's head performed another of those disturbing tilts. How much more time? Good question. How long did it take to figure out how to teach a species that had evolved past the need for traditional education? How did you engage minds that processed information through chemical signals and territorial instincts rather than verbal instruction and visual aids? 2 weeks, she said, pulling the timeline out of thin air with the confidence of someone who had absolutely no idea what she was doing. 2 weeks, Gavex repeated slowly. And if you're unsuccessful? Then we'll discuss alternative approaches. Which was administrators speak for, I'll admit defeat and find a new career that doesn't involve small predators with boundary issues. After Gavex left, Zoe slumped into her chair and stared at the lesson plans scattered across her desk. Quantum Mechanics for Beginners. Introduction to Galactic History. Basic Diplomatic Protocol. All perfectly reasonable topics for young minds eager to understand the universe around them. The problem was, she was beginning to suspect that the Velnari cubs weren't lacking eagerness. They were lacking a reason to care about any of this. Their species had dominated their homeworld through strength, cunning, and an intuitive understanding of their environment. Why would they need to know about quantum mechanics when their ancestors had survived perfectly well by trusting their instincts? She picked up her stylus and began doodling absently in the margins of her lesson plan. Nothing elaborate, just simple shapes and patterns that helped her think. A spiral here, a geometric design there, the outline of a tree from her childhood home on Earth. The soft hiss of the ventilation system above her head made her look up. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw movement in the shadows between the ceiling panels. But when she blinked, there was nothing there. Probably her imagination. After all, what were the odds that a group of cubs who'd perfected the art of avoiding her classes would be curious enough to spy on her during her planning time? Then again, this was shaping up to be exactly the kind of day where the impossible seemed perfectly reasonable. Zoe went back to her doodling, but now she found herself sketching with a bit more deliberation. If there was someone, or several someones, watching from the shadows, well, it couldn't hurt to give them something interesting to look at. After all, she only had 2 weeks to figure out how to teach the unteachable. Might as well start with whatever came naturally, even if that meant drawing pictures like a 5-year-old and hoping for the best. 3 days into her 2-week deadline, Zoe had officially abandoned any pretense of following the approved curriculum. The quantum mechanics textbook lay forgotten under a stack of requisition forms, and her carefully prepared lesson on galactic diplomatic protocols had been converted into a rather artistic paper airplane that now decorated the far corner of the room. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor, with a tablet and stylus, sketching whatever came to mind while she tried to figure out where exactly she'd gone wrong in life. The official class time had come and gone, as had the Cubs, who'd managed to avoid the classroom with their usual supernatural efficiency. "Let's see," she muttered, adding shading to what was becoming a surprisingly detailed drawing of a waterfall she'd visited during her undergraduate years. Career options for failed xenobiologists, retail sales, food service, professional couch surfing. A soft scraping sound from the ceiling made her pause. She'd been hearing odd noises for days now, little scratches and whispers that could have been the station's aging ventilation system, or could have been something else entirely. Given that this was Nexus Prime, where something else entirely was usually the correct answer, she'd started paying attention. The scraping came again, more deliberate this time. Definitely not random mechanical noise. Zoe continued drawing, but now she tilted the tablet slightly so that anyone watching from above would have a clear view of her work. If she was being observed, and given the Velnari Cubs' apparent mastery of architectural navigation, she probably was. Then maybe it was time to give them something worth observing. She started a new drawing, a simple landscape from Earth, complete with rolling hills, a few scattered trees, and a sky dotted with clouds. Nothing fancy, just the kind of scene that might catch the eye of someone who'd never seen anything like it before. The scratching sounds stopped. Interesting. Zoe added more details to the landscape: a winding path, some wildflowers, a small stream bubbling through the scene. She found herself narrating silently as she worked, as if explaining the image to an invisible audience. This is what we call grass. It grows in individual blades, but forms large fields when there's enough of it. These are called flowers. They're how some plants reproduce, but humans also enjoy them for their colors and scents. A new sound joined the scratching, a soft chittering that definitely didn't belong to any ventilation system. The universal sound of curious youngsters trying to communicate without getting caught. "You know," Zoe said aloud, still focused on her drawing, "where I come from, we have these things called meadows. They're basically giant fields covered in grass and flowers, with trees scattered around the edges." She added a few more trees to illustrate the point. The grass moves in the wind, making patterns like waves on water. More chittering from above, accompanied by what sounded suspiciously like multiple sets of claws repositioning themselves for a better view. Zoe started a new drawing, this time a cityscape. But not just any cityscape. She drew the gleaming spires of New Geneva, with its impossible architecture and gravity-defying transport tubes. Then, for contrast, she sketched a small rural village nestled in a valley, complete with gardens and winding cobblestone streets. "Some humans live in big cities with millions of people," she explained to her invisible audience. "Others prefer small communities where everyone knows each other. Different environments, different ways of living, but they're all human settlements." The chittering grew more animated. She was definitely not alone in this room. Encouraged, Zoe began a series of quick sketches. Animals from Earth, each with a brief explanation. A dolphin leaping from ocean waves. They live in water but breathe air, and they're almost as intelligent as humans. A bird in flight. They use wing structures to generate lift and navigate through atmosphere. A domestic cat. Small predators that humans keep as companions. They hunt tiny prey and sleep approximately 20 hours per day. That last one earned her what sounded distinctly like Velnari laughter. She was halfway through sketching a rather ambitious underwater scene when a ceiling panel shifted with a soft clang. A sleek, scaled head appeared in the gap, followed immediately by two more. Three pairs of large, golden eyes stared down at her with undisguised fascination. Vilks hung upside down from the ceiling, her natural camouflage making her blend seamlessly with the shadows. Beside her, Brex and Gulm had positioned themselves to get the best possible view of Zoe's tablet screen. "Comfortable up there?" Zoe asked mildly, not looking up from her drawing. The cubs exchanged rapid glances. Vilks's pheromone signature shifted to what Zoe had learned to recognize as embarrassment mixed with defiance. But none of them retreated. "The water creatures," Brex said finally, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone speaking in a non-native language. "They do not possess respiratory adaptations for aquatic environments?" Zoe blinked. In 3 weeks of attempted lessons, this was the first direct question any of the cubs had asked her. "Some do, some don't. Dolphins and whales breathe air, but fish have gills that extract oxygen directly from water." "Show us the gill structures," Gulm demanded, with the imperious tone of a young predator accustomed to having his curiosity satisfied immediately. Instead of explaining, Zoe drew. A simple fish in profile, with clear labels indicating the gill slits and a brief visual explanation of how water flowed through them. Then, for comparison, she sketched a dolphin's blowhole and showed how it surfaced to breathe. The cubs' chittering intensified. They were clearly communicating among themselves in their native language, a complex mix of vocalizations and chemical signals that her translation software couldn't parse. "The visual representations," Vilks said slowly. "They are accurate?" "Not artistic interpretation." "Mostly accurate," Zoe replied. "I'm simplifying some details, but the basic structures are correct." "And you create these images from memory?" Brex asked. "Some from memory, some from imagination." "Humans use visual art to communicate ideas, record information, and sometimes just for entertainment. The concept seemed to mystify them. Vilks's head tilted at an angle that would have been physically impossible for most species. "Your species documents reality through drawing?" "Among other methods, yes. We also use photography, video recording, written language, sculpture." Zoe trailed off as she realized she was essentially conducting her first successful lesson with a group of cubs hanging upside down from the ceiling. "Would you like to see more examples?" The cubs' unanimous chittering suggested enthusiastic agreement. Over the next hour, Zoe found herself providing the most unconventional education session of her career. She drew ecosystems from dozens of worlds, showing how different species adapted to their environments. She sketched examples of symbiotic relationships, predator-prey dynamics, and evolutionary adaptations. And somehow, without ever mentioning quantum mechanics or diplomatic protocols, she ended up explaining concepts of physics, biology, and sociology. The cubs absorbed every image with intense focus, asking questions that revealed sharp, analytical minds. They wanted to understand how atmospheric composition affected wing design, why certain color patterns indicated toxicity, how social structures varied between species. "Your species," Gulm observed during a discussion of pack hunting strategies, "you share knowledge through these visual records?" "That's one way we do it," Zoe confirmed. "Humans are very visual learners. We process information better when we can see it represented graphically." "But you also learn through auditory input, olfactory data, tactile experience," Vilks asked. "Yes, but vision is our primary sense. We evolved as diurnal creatures, active during daylight hours, so our brains are wired to prioritize visual information. The cubs exchanged another round of rapid communication. Zoe caught fragments through her translator. No wonder the curriculum failed. Auditory-focused methodology. Chemical markers incompatible. "Wait," she said, a suspicion forming. "How does your species typically learn?" "Through scent trails and territorial markings," Brex explained. "Our elders leave chemical signatures that convey complex information about hunting grounds, safe territories, resource locations. Young cubs follow these trails and gradually decode their meanings. And social instruction occurs through demonstration and mimicry," Felix added. "We observe successful behaviors and replicate them until we achieve mastery." Zoe stared at them. So, the traditional classroom setup: sitting still, listening to verbal instruction, reading text, is fundamentally incompatible with our neurological processing patterns, Gulm finished. "We require movement, chemical context, and visual demonstration to encode information effectively." The pieces clicked into place with stunning clarity. No wonder the cubs had been avoiding her classes. She'd been trying to teach visual and kinesthetic learners through exclusively auditory methods, in a sterile environment that provided none of the contextual cues their brains needed to process information. "How long have you known this?" she asked. The cub's guilty silence was answer enough. "And you didn't think to mention it? Because?" "Because," Wilkes said quietly. "The adults believe that adaptation to standard educational protocols is necessary for successful integration with other species. They view our natural learning preferences as primitive, as if millions of years of evolutionary refinement could be dismissed as inferior simply because it didn't fit the consortium's standardized model." Zoe looked at her tablet, then at the 3 brilliant young minds hanging from her ceiling, and felt something shift in her understanding of the situation. Maybe the problem wasn't that the cubs were unteachable. Maybe the problem was that everyone had been trying to teach them wrong. Word of Zoe's unconventional methods spread through Nexus Prime's administrative levels with the kind of efficiency usually reserved for catastrophic system failures and cafeteria food poisoning incidents. By the end of the week, she'd received 3 formal inquiries, 2 requests for detailed reports, and 1 thinly veiled threat disguised as a performance evaluation scheduling notice. She ignored them all and kept drawing. The cubs, meanwhile, had abandoned all pretense of avoiding her classroom. They'd also abandoned the ceiling, having apparently decided that hanging upside down for hours at a time was unnecessarily dramatic. Instead, they'd claimed territories around the room with the kind of casual territorial dominance that would have been alarming if Zoe hadn't started to understand their psychology. Vilix had established herself near the window, where the natural light created optimal viewing conditions for detailed sketches. Brex had chosen a spot by the wall display, perfect for projecting images to larger scale. Gulm had commandeered the corner nearest the supply cabinet because, as he'd explained with impeccable predator logic, resources should be defended. "Today," Zoe announced, settling into what had become her usual spot in the center of their territorial triangle, "we're going to talk about ecosystems." "Which ones?" Gulm asked immediately. The cubs had developed an endearing habit of treating every lesson announcement as the opening move in a negotiation. "All of them," Zoe replied cheerfully. "Starting with this." She began sketching a coral reef, building the image layer by layer. First, the skeletal structure of the coral itself, then the fish that lived among the branches, then the larger predators that hunted in deeper waters. Each organism here has a specific role, she explained as she drew. The coral provides shelter and breeding grounds for smaller fish. The small fish clean parasites from larger fish. The larger fish control populations of mid-sized species. Symbiotic relationships, Vilux observed. Exactly. But watch what happens when you remove one element. Zoe created a second image, identical to the first, but with the coral bleached white and dying. Without healthy coral, the small fish lose their habitat. Without small fish, the cleaning symbiosis breaks down. Without population control from larger predators, some species overbreed and exhaust their food sources. Brex chittered thoughtfully. Cascading system failure. Now apply that same principle to social ecosystems. Zoe started a new series of sketches. A village, a city, a space. Station. Different environments, different species, but the same fundamental relationships. Remove one crucial element, and the entire system becomes unstable. She was 3 sketches into what was becoming an elaborate comparative analysis when the classroom door hissed open with the kind of aggressive timing that suggested official displeasure. Holnex entered with all the warmth and flexibility of a bureaucratic ice storm. The senior Velnari educator had been monitoring Zoe's experimental approaches with the kind of benevolent hostility usually reserved for tax audits and medical examinations. "I trust," Holnex said, her voice carrying harmonics that made every Velnari in the room instinctively straighten, "that today's lesson plan follows approved educational protocols." The cub's pheromone signatures shifted dramatically. Zoe didn't need translation software to recognize the chemical cocktail of anxiety, resentment, and barely suppressed rebellion now perfuming the air. "We're studying ecosystem dynamics," Zoe replied with perfect honesty. "Cross-species symbiotic relationships, resource management, and social stability factors." Holnex's scaled head tilted as she processed this information. Through visual representation methodologies. Among other techniques. "I see." Holnex moved further into the room, her gaze taking in the territorial arrangement of cubs, the scattered sketches, and the general absence of traditional educational materials. "And this approach is yielding measurable learning outcomes." Before Zoe could answer, Golm spoke up with the kind of timing that suggested either perfect innocence or carefully calculated mischief. "We have achieved comprehension of symbiotic ecosystem dynamics across 15 different environmental classifications," he announced in formal academic language, "including theoretical application to multi-species social structures and resource distribution networks." Holnex's surprise was visible in the subtle shift of her scales from their usual deep black to a lighter charcoal shade. "You have?" "Demonstrate," Brex added, settling back with the satisfied air of someone about to enjoy a show. Vilks took the challenge with the enthusiasm of a young predator presented with an opportunity to show off. "Observe, terrestrial forest ecosystem." She gestured toward one of Zoe's sketches. "Primary producers, photosynthetic flora. Primary consumers, herbivorous fauna. Secondary consumers, small predators. Tertiary consumers, apex predators. Decomposers, bacterial and fungal organisms. Energy transfer occurs through consumption relationships," Golm continued seamlessly. "Approximately 10% efficiency between trophic levels. Remove apex predators. Herbivore populations increase beyond carrying capacity. Vegetation degradation follows. System collapse occurs within 3 to 5 reproductive cycles. Now observe comparable dynamics in social ecosystem," Brex added, pointing to Zoe's space station. "Sketch, primary resource producers, agricultural and manufacturing specialists, primary consumers, general population, secondary consumers, administrative classes, tertiary consumers, leadership hierarchies, system maintenance, technical and service personnel. Holnex's scales had shifted to an even lighter shade, which Zoe was beginning to recognize as the Velnari equivalent of slack-jawed amazement. The parallel structures demonstrate universal organizational principles, Vilux concluded with academic precision. Resource flow, hierarchical relationships, and systemic dependencies remain consistent across biological and social frameworks. The silence that followed this impromptu lecture stretched long enough to become educational in itself. Holnex stared at the cubs as if they'd spontaneously developed the ability to perform quantum calculations in their heads. Which, Zoe realized with growing excitement, maybe they had. "How long?" Holnex asked slowly. "Have you been attending these sessions?" 6 days, Brex replied. "And you have achieved this level of conceptual integration in 6 days?" "Visual learning protocols are highly efficient for our cognitive processing patterns," Gulm explained with the patient tone of someone stating the obvious. "Professor Zoe's methodology provides optimal information encoding conditions." Professor Zoe. She tried not to smile at the impromptu promotion. Holnex moved closer to examine the sketches scattered around the room. Her expression was unreadable, but her pheromone signature was broadcasting what Zoe's translation software identified as intense cognitive recalibration in progress. "These images," Holnex said finally, "they represent accurate scientific information?" "Simplified but accurate," Zoe confirmed. "I adjust the complexity level based on what concepts we're exploring, but the fundamental relationships are correct." "And this technique is standard among human educational approaches?" "For visual learners, yes. We use diagrams, charts, illustrations, and demonstration models extensively." Holnex studied a particularly detailed sketch of a predator-prey relationship cycle. "Your species processes information primarily through visual input." "That's right." "Whereas our species processes information primarily through chemical and territorial markers." "Also correct." "So by adapting your visual methodologies to our learning patterns, you have created a hybrid approach that—" Holnex paused, clearly working through the implications. "That accommodates both species' neurological preferences." "That's actually exactly what happened," Zoe realized. "I wasn't trying to force them to learn like humans. I was using human techniques to support their natural learning style." The cubs exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Vilx's chemical signature shifted to what Zoe had learned to recognize as carefully controlled excitement. "Professor Zoe," Vilux said with formal precision, "would it be possible to apply similar methodologies to other subject areas?" Before Zoe could answer, Brex added, "We have developed questions regarding mathematical relationship visualization and scientific principle demonstration through graphic representation," Gulm contributed, "and social interaction pattern analysis across species boundaries," Vilux finished. Zoe looked at Holnex, who was still staring at the sketches with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was undergoing rapid structural renovation. "I think," Zoe said carefully, "we might need to revise the curriculum." The pheromone signatures in the room shifted to unanimous agreement, with undertones of what could only be described as barely contained anticipation. This was either going to be the greatest educational revolution in galactic history, or the most spectacular failure ever recorded in the consortium archives. Possibly both. The revolution began the next morning, when Zoe arrived to find her classroom transformed into what could only be described as organized chaos. The cubs had rearranged the furniture into a configuration that made no sense to human spatial logic, but clearly followed some kind of Velnari territorial optimization. They'd also somehow acquired additional art supplies. She decided not to ask how, and had begun creating their own visual learning materials. "We have prepared preliminary research questions," Brex announced, with the solemnity of someone presenting a doctoral thesis, beginning with mathematical visualization. What followed was the most bizarre and brilliant teaching session of Zoe's career. The Cubs had intuited that abstract mathematical concepts could be represented through visual metaphors, and they wanted to understand everything at once. Algebra became landscape mapping, where variables were represented by different terrain features and equations showed how those features related to each other. Geometry transformed into architectural planning, with three-dimensional shapes becoming the building blocks of habitable structures. But why do the angular relationships remain constant, regardless of scale modification? Vilix asked, sketching increasingly complex geometric progressions with alarming speed. "Because geometric principles are universal," Zoe explained, adding her own illustrations to demonstrate. "The relationships between angles and sides in similar triangles don't change whether you're building a shelter or mapping a solar system." The Cubs absorbed this information with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for hunting behavior. They asked follow-up questions that revealed they were making connections between mathematical concepts and practical applications at a rate that should have been impossible. Then Wicks arrived. The multi-limbed educator had been monitoring the situation from a distance, but the pheromone signatures escaping from Zoe's classroom had apparently become too intriguing to ignore. He entered, cautiously, all 6 of his appendages positioned for rapid retreat if necessary. "I was hoping," he said in his species' characteristic melodic tones, "to observe these new teaching methods." The Cubs immediately focused on him with the kind of attention that made most visitors nervous. Wicks, to his credit, held his ground. "Professor Wicks," Golm said formally, "do your species utilize visual information processing?" "To some degree, yes. We're primarily tactile learners, but we do process visual data." "Demonstrate optimal learning methodology for your species," Vilix requested, with the imperious tone of a young scientist demanding experimental data. What happened next defied every educational protocol in the consortium handbook. Zoe found herself facilitating a 3-way teaching exchange, where each species demonstrated their optimal learning style while the others observed and adapted. The Cubs showed Wicks how territorial mapping could represent complex relationships. Wicks demonstrated how tactile manipulation of objects could reinforce abstract concepts. And Zoe provided visual frameworks that helped both species process information in new ways. "This is—" Wicks paused, clearly searching for adequate terminology. "This is pedagogical innovation on a scale I have never witnessed. This is completely unauthorized experimental methodology," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Gavex stood in the entrance, his posture radiating official disapproval. Behind him, 3 more administrators from different species clustered like a delegation of academic censure. "Administrator Gavex," Zoe said, trying to project confidence while 3 Cubs and 1 multi-limbed educator looked on with obvious interest. "I can explain." "Explanation will not be necessary," he interrupted. "The Consortium Educational Council has scheduled a formal review of your methods tomorrow, with full documentation requirements and standardized assessment protocols." The pheromone signatures in the room shifted dramatically. The Cubs' chemical communications became rapid and agitated, while Wicks's appendages curled in what Zoe recognized as defensive positioning. "What kind of assessment?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The Cubs will be tested according to standard curriculum benchmarks, one of the other administrators announced. If they cannot demonstrate appropriate knowledge acquisition through traditional evaluation methods, this experiment will be terminated. Traditional evaluation methods: written tests, verbal examinations, standardized protocols designed for species that learned through auditory instruction and textual analysis. Everything that the Cubs' neurological patterns were fundamentally incompatible with. "That's not fair," Zoe said, abandoning diplomatic language. "You're testing them using methods that don't match their learning style." "The methods are universal," Gavex replied coldly. "If the knowledge has been truly acquired, the evaluation format should be irrelevant." Zoe opened her mouth to argue, then noticed the Cubs' expressions. They weren't showing the anxiety or resentment she'd expected. Instead, their pheromone signatures had shifted to something that smelled distinctly like predatory anticipation. "We accept the assessment challenge," Brex announced with formal precision. "All three of us," Vilex added. "Using standard evaluation protocols," Gulm confirmed. The administrators exchanged glances. Clearly they'd expected resistance, not eager acceptance. "Very well," Gavex said slowly. "Tomorrow morning, standard curriculum assessment, full documentation." After the delegation left, Zoe turned to the Cubs with growing concern. "Are you sure about this? Those tests are designed to demonstrate knowledge acquisition through traditional academic frameworks," Vilks interrupted. "We understand. But you learn differently. Your brains process information through chemical and territorial markers, not—" "Professor Zoe," Brex said gently, "we have been observing consortium educational methods for months. We understand how other species prefer to demonstrate knowledge. The question," Gulm added with a distinctly predatory smile, "is whether the administrators understand what we have actually learned." Zoe looked at their confident expressions and felt something that might have been hope, mixed with the kind of anticipation that usually preceded either triumph or complete disaster. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting. The assessment chamber buzzed with the kind of nervous energy usually associated with diplomatic crises and experimental reactor tests. Representatives from 6 different species had gathered to witness what the official documentation described as evaluation of non-standard educational methodologies, and what everyone else understood to be either vindication or spectacular public failure. Zoe sat in the designated observer section, trying to project confidence while her stomach performed acrobatic maneuvers that defied several laws of physics. Beside her, Wicks had arranged all 6 appendages in what she'd learned was his species' equivalent of crossed fingers. The Cubs entered the chamber with the fluid grace of apex predators who knew exactly where they stood in the food chain. They'd abandoned their usual casual territorial arrangement in favor of a more formal configuration that somehow managed to be both respectful and subtly intimidating. "Begin with mathematical foundations," announced the lead assessor, a Cathani official whose crystalline structure reflected the chamber's lighting in prismatic patterns. "Standard computational analysis, level 5 complexity." What followed was the most surreal academic examination in galactic history. The Cubs approached the mathematical problems with methodical precision, but their solving techniques bore no resemblance to standard computational methods. Instead of working through equations linearly, they drew spatial representations, creating visual maps of numerical relationships that somehow yielded correct answers through completely unorthodox pathways. "Explain your methodology," the Cathani assessor requested after watching Brex solve a complex algebraic problem by sketching what appeared to be a hunting territory map. "Mathematical relationships follow territorial patterns," Brex replied matter-of-factly. Variables represent resource locations. Equations show optimal path calculations between resources. Solution emerges from territorial optimization analysis. The assessor's crystalline facets shifted through several color phases, which Zoe had learned indicated deep cognitive processing. That is, mathematically sound, though highly unconventional. Unconventional but effective, Vilux added, completing her own problem set through what looked like an elaborate dance notation system. Human visual methodologies adapted to Velnari cognitive patterns produce hybrid analytical approaches. The examination continued through scientific principles, where the cubs demonstrated their understanding by creating impromptu ecosystem models using available materials. They built food webs with furniture, illustrated chemical reactions through territorial boundary diagrams, and explained quantum mechanics by comparing particle behavior to pack hunting strategies. Every answer was correct, every explanation was scientifically accurate, and every single approach violated traditional educational assumptions about knowledge acquisition and demonstration. "This is impossible," muttered one of the administrators in the observation section. "They're using completely non-standard methodologies." "But getting correct results," Wicks pointed out helpfully. The real revelation came during the cultural studies portion of the exam. The assessors presented a complex scenario involving interspecies diplomatic negotiations, expecting the cubs to demonstrate their understanding of standard protocol procedures. Instead, Gulm stood up and began sketching. "The fundamental error in consortium diplomatic methodology," he announced, while drawing what appeared to be a territorial conflict diagram, "lies in the assumption that all species process social information through identical frameworks." He created a visual representation showing how different species communication styles, chemical, auditory, visual, tactile, created natural barriers to understanding. Then he showed how those same differences could become advantages when properly utilized. Observe. Species A communicates through pheromone release, providing detailed emotional and intentional context. Species B communicates through harmonic variation, allowing complex layered meaning. Species C communicates through visual representation, enabling rapid information transfer across language barriers. Vilks picked up the explanation seamlessly. Standard diplomatic protocol requires all species to communicate through translated verbal exchange, effectively eliminating each species' optimal information sharing capabilities. Alternative approach, Brex continued, utilizes each species' natural communication strengths within structured framework. Chemical signatures provide emotional context. Harmonic variations convey nuanced meaning. Visual representations ensure accurate information transfer. The cubs had just deconstructed and redesigned interspecies diplomatic theory using concepts they'd learned through drawing pictures and discussing ecosystem relationships. The silence in the chamber stretched until it became almost physical. Then Gavex's voice cut through the quiet with the precision of a carefully aimed weapon. "How long have you possessed this level of analytical capability?" The cubs exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Vilux's pheromone signature shifted to what Zoe recognized as carefully controlled defiance mixed with something that might have been relief. "We have always possessed these analytical capabilities," Vilux said quietly. "We simply lacked appropriate frameworks for expressing them." "The traditional curriculum," Brex added, "assumes knowledge acquisition through methods incompatible with our neurological processing patterns. We attended those sessions but gained no meaningful information. So we developed our own learning networks," Gulm explained. "Through exploration, experimentation, and observation of functional systems throughout the station. The implications hit the assembled administrators like a cascade of small explosions. The Cubs hadn't been avoiding education. They'd been pursuing it through their own methodologies, while the official program failed to engage them. The hydroponics experiments, Gavek said slowly. Botanical research into environmental adaptation patterns, Felix confirmed. The ventilation system exploration. Atmospheric circulation analysis and architectural mapping studies, Brex replied. The cargo bay incidents. Materials science and structural engineering investigations, Gulm finished. They'd been conducting their own advanced studies while everyone assumed they were being disruptive. The realization sent ripples of shocked recognition through the observation section. Why? Asked the Cathani assessor. Did you not communicate this information previously? The Cubs' unified pheromone response carried harmonics of frustration, disappointment, and something deeper. Something that translated roughly as betrayal. Because, Wilkes said with careful precision, adults consistently dismissed our natural learning preferences as primitive behaviors requiring correction, rather than cognitive advantages requiring development. The truth landed with the kind of impact usually reserved for small asteroids and major diplomatic revelations. The consortium's educational system hadn't just failed to teach the Cubs. It had actively discouraged their natural learning abilities while assuming their difficulties indicated intellectual limitations. Professor Zoe, Brex continued, was the first educator to observe our actual capabilities and adapt her methods to support rather than suppress our cognitive strengths. Through visual methodologies that bridged human and Velnari information processing patterns, Vilux added, creating hybrid educational approaches that maximize rather than minimize species-specific learning advantages, Gulm concluded. The chamber erupted into rapid discussions as representatives processed the implications. If the Cubs' experience was representative, how many other species' educational needs were being ignored or actively thwarted by standardized approaches? 6 months later, Zoe stood in her new office, significantly larger than her previous classroom, and reviewed reports from educational programs across 17 different worlds. The Nexus Integration Protocol, as it had been formally designated, was producing learning outcomes that exceeded every previous benchmark while dramatically reducing interspecies educational conflicts. The irony wasn't lost on her that humanity's supposedly primitive reliance on visual learning had become the foundation for the most advanced educational methodology in known space. Sometimes the most sophisticated solutions came from the simplest approaches, and sometimes teaching unteachable students just required learning how to see what they were really capable of achieving. The Cubs, now serving as education consultants to the Consortium Council, had moved on to redesigning diplomatic protocols using interpretive dance and advanced chemistry. The transformation hadn't been limited to educational methodology. Within weeks of the assessment revelation, Nexus Prime had become an unofficial laboratory for interspecies communication innovation. Species that had maintained polite but distant relationships for centuries were suddenly finding common ground through shared learning experiences. The Cathani delegation had started incorporating chemical signature recognition into their crystalline harmonic communications after watching Velnari Cubs demonstrate scent-based information transfer. The Zorathi youngsters, previously considered too aggressive for group learning, thrived when their natural competitive instincts were channeled into collaborative research projects. The most amusing development, Wicks mentioned during one of their weekly progress reviews, is that several species have formally requested human educators for their home world programs. Zoe laughed, remembering her initial doubts about volunteering for what had seemed like the worst assignment in the galaxy. I suppose there's something to be said for accidentally stumbling into revolutionary teaching methods. "Professor Zoe," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Vilks entered with her characteristic predatory grace, now augmented by what could only be described as scholarly confidence. "We have completed the preliminary analysis for the Andromedan Integration Project." She carried a portfolio of visual materials that would have been incomprehensible 6 months ago, but now represented the cutting edge of intergalactic educational design. The Cubs had taken their hybrid learning methodology and expanded it into frameworks for species they'd never even met. "Excellent timing," Zoe replied. "The council meeting is in an hour." As they prepared for another session of explaining why drawing pictures was actually the most sophisticated teaching tool in known space, Zoe reflected on the unexpected trajectory of her career. She'd set out to teach a few rebellious cubs basic academic concepts and had accidentally revolutionized education for multiple civilizations. The best part was that none of it would have happened if she hadn't finally admitted that traditional methods weren't working and decided to try something completely different. Sometimes the most important discoveries came from abandoning everything you thought you knew and letting curiosity lead the way. Just like the Cubs had been trying to tell everyone all along. Zoe couldn't wait to see what they'd figure out next.